The calls for justice grew louder with each passing day. Protesters filled the streets, chanting not just for Danielle but for everyone who had ever been stopped, questioned, or mistreated for simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Civil rights organizations filed lawsuits. Community leaders demanded immediate action. The Department of Justice announced a broader inquiry not just into the arrest but into the entire department's history of complaints and internal handling. Captain Monroe faced the cameras outside the precinct one rainy afternoon, standing under a gray sky with microphones pointed at her from every direction. She didn't sugarcoat it. She acknowledged that trust had been broken. She promised full cooperation with every investigation. And most importantly, she promised that what happened to Danielle Carter would not be buried or forgotten. Inside her office later that night, Monroe sat at her desk, the weight of everything pressing down on her. This wasn't just about fixing one officer's mistake. It was about fixing a culture that had allowed that mistake to happen in the first place. And as she glanced out the window at the protesters still gathered with their signs held high, she knew the world was watching, and there was no turning back. Danielle Carter never intended to become the face of police reform, but after everything that had happened, she knew she couldn't stay silent. She hadn't just lived through an injustice. She had lived through a moment that revealed cracks not only in a precinct but across an entire system. And if someone in her position could be treated that way, she could only imagine what happened to people without the shield of a title or public recognition. So instead of letting anger guide her, she turned toward action with a quiet, determined focus. From her office in Washington, Danielle began working with a small but dedicated team, pulling together ideas that had been talked about for years but never fully acted on. She knew reforms needed more than just good intentions. They needed structure, oversight, and a commitment that went deeper than a few new training sessions or public apologies. She called it the Accountability and Cultural Reform Pilot Program, but at its heart, it was about something simpler: rebuilding trust between officers and the communities they were supposed to serve. The pilot program wasn't just about punishing bad behavior. It was about preventing it. It focused on transparency at every level, mandatory body cameras with strict policies against tampering, community oversight panels with real authority, and routine independent audits of precinct operations. Danielle insisted that officers receive ongoing training, not just once but continuously, covering de-escalation techniques, cultural sensitivity, and constitutional rights. She pushed for a clear, simple complaint process where citizens could report misconduct without fear or endless bureaucracy. Getting the first city to agree wasn't easy. Some local leaders worried about the politics. Others feared backlash from the rank-and-file officers who had grown used to doing things a certain way. But Danielle's approach made a difference. She wasn't coming in to point fingers or place blame. She was coming in to fix a system that had failed everyone, officers included. Her message was clear: accountability wasn't anti-police, it was pro-community, and in the end, it would make everyone safer. The first precinct to adopt the program was the very one where she had been arrested. Captain Monroe, to her credit, threw her full support behind it, understanding that real change meant embracing discomfort and facing hard truths. Danielle met with officers directly, not behind podiums or press conferences, but face-to-face in quiet conference rooms. She listened to their fears, their frustrations, their hopes. She spoke about her own experiences not as an outsider looking in but as someone who had stood exactly where they had, feeling the weight of a badge and the responsibility it carried. The changes started slowly. Officers were required to participate in new training sessions, and at first, there was resistance. Some rolled their eyes, sat stiffly through lectures, and mumbled about politics. But over time, something shifted. The more open conversations they had about bias, about the role fear played in their decisions, about the difference between authority and service, the more officers began to understand that the reforms weren't a punishment. They were an opportunity to be better, to do their jobs with pride and with the community's trust behind them. Outside the precinct, Danielle worked just as hard. She spoke at town halls, met with civil rights leaders, and visited schools and churches to hear from citizens who had long felt unseen. Her message was always the same: change was coming, but it wouldn't be forced from above. It had to grow from within, with the community and officers building it together, one step at a time. Word of the pilot program's early successes spread fast. Other cities started calling. Could they adopt the same model? Could they bring Danielle and her team in to help them clean up their own departments? What started as one precinct's reckoning was slowly turning into a movement. Danielle traveled from city to city, sharing the blueprint, adapting it to different communities, always insisting that transparency and fairness weren't optional. They were the foundation for everything else. The work was exhausting, and the road was far from smooth. There were setbacks, angry letters, protests from those who thought reform meant weakness. But Danielle never wavered. She knew real change took time, took grit, and above all, took a willingness to see beyond fear and pride. Every conversation she had, every policy she pushed, was another brick laid in rebuilding the kind of law enforcement system the country deserved. Danielle Carter hadn't asked for this fight, but she had embraced it fully. And as the reforms took root, one precinct at a time, she knew they were building something that would last. Not because they had to, but because finally, people were demanding it. As Danielle Carter's pilot program gained momentum, something unexpected began to happen. As officers adjusted to the new culture of transparency and accountability, old cases started to resurface. Whistleblowers who had stayed silent for years suddenly found the courage to come forward. Complaints once buried under layers of bureaucracy were pulled from dusty filing cabinets. And the more Danielle and her team dug, the clearer it became that the issues weren't just limited to one precinct or one bad officer. They were part of something much bigger, something that stretched far beyond the city limits. It started with a few old emails uncovered during an internal audit. They weren't dramatic on their own, but together they painted a troubling picture. Messages between commanders discussing how to downplay excessive force reports, suggestions on how to reword incident descriptions to avoid triggering investigations, quiet conversations about which officers to protect and which complaints to bury. It was a system, informal but real, designed to shield misconduct from the public eye. Danielle had expected pushback when she launched the reforms. She hadn't expected to find a hidden network quietly operating under the radar. Word spread among other precincts, and soon Danielle's team began receiving anonymous tips. Retired officers, former administrators, even current staff who had grown tired of watching the same patterns play out all stepped forward. They described unwritten rules about how to handle internal investigations, how to pressure complainants into dropping cases, how to make inconvenient footage disappear. They talked about informal alliances between departments, precincts sharing best practices not for protecting communities, but for protecting themselves. And it wasn't just a few bad actors in isolated cities. It was a pattern that repeated itself across states and regions. Danielle and her team documented everything carefully. They cross-referenced names, dates, complaint histories, and disciplinary records. They found clusters of officers who had been quietly transferred instead of disciplined, precincts that showed sudden drops in misconduct reports without any real change in practices, training programs that preached de-escalation while tolerating aggression behind closed doors. It wasn't sloppy or accidental. It was systematic, and it had been going on for years. The realization hit hard. Danielle understood now that real reform wasn't just about retraining officers or improving complaint systems. It was about tearing down a deeply entrenched culture of silence, fear, and self-protection. And it wouldn't be enough to fix one precinct or one city. The entire network had to be exposed if there was going to be any hope of lasting change. She took her findings to the Justice Department, laying out the connections they had uncovered with careful, undeniable evidence. The reaction was swift. A national task force was formed, and Danielle was asked to serve as one of its lead advisors. The task force was charged with investigating not just the most obvious cases of misconduct, but the structures that had allowed bad behavior to thrive unchecked. 4 weeks, Danielle's life became a whirlwind of meetings, interviews, and late-night strategy sessions. She traveled across the country, visiting departments large and small, listening to officers who had been pressured into silence, reviewing records that had been hidden away for years. Some cities resisted, refusing to cooperate or claiming they had nothing to hide. Others opened their doors willingly, eager for help in cleaning house and starting fresh. The work was exhausting, sometimes disheartening, but every new piece of evidence added strength to their case. Danielle and her team exposed informal mentorship networks that taught young officers how to navigate around accountability. They uncovered secret groups where misconduct was not just tolerated but celebrated. They found examples of officers who had been accused repeatedly of excessive force but had never faced real consequences, moving quietly from precinct to precinct as if bad behavior were just part of the job. Each revelation fed a growing national conversation. People were no longer willing to accept the idea that misconduct was just a few bad apples. They saw it for what it was, a system that protected itself at the expense of the people it was supposed to serve. Public trust, already fragile, hung in the balance. Through it all, Danielle stayed grounded. She reminded her team that the goal wasn't to tear down law enforcement. It was to rebuild it in a way that honored its highest ideals. It was about ensuring that no one, no matter their badge or their title, was above the law. And as the evidence mounted, as the web of misconduct came into full view, Danielle knew they were no longer just fighting for reform. They were fighting for the very soul of justice itself. Officer Reynolds had always seen himself as untouchable. Even as the public turned against him, even as his colleagues began keeping their distance, he clung to the belief that he could fight his way back. He wasn't ready to admit he had crossed a line. In his mind, he was the victim of a political witch hunt, not the architect of his own downfall. So when whispers of a counterattack reached him, he grabbed onto them like a drowning man clutches a life raft. His plan was simple and desperate: shift the narrative, cast doubt, and hope that enough confusion could save him. It started with carefully leaked rumors to fringe media outlets. Anonymous sources claimed that Danielle Carter had been confrontational during the stop, that she had refused basic orders, that Officer Reynolds had been forced to act. Fabricated stories suggested that Danielle had a personal vendetta against law enforcement and had set up the encounter to push a hidden agenda. The goal wasn't to prove innocence. It was to muddy the waters just enough that people would start asking questions. If they couldn't make Reynolds look good, maybe they could make Danielle look suspicious. For a brief moment, the strategy seemed to gain traction. A handful of commentators picked up the story, framing it as a cautionary tale about rushing to judgment. Social media accounts spread doctored footage, cutting scenes out of context to make Danielle's calm questions seem argumentative. Online discussions filled with manufactured outrage, accusing her of playing the victim for political gain. To an outside observer not paying close attention, it might have looked like the tide was turning. But the thing about lies is they can only hold up for so long under real scrutiny. Danielle's team had anticipated this move. They didn't engage directly with the noise. They stayed focused, calmly releasing full footage, unedited reports, and witness statements that showed exactly what had happened from beginning to end. They reminded the public of the facts without feeding into the drama. Every time a new smear surfaced, the response was simple and steady. Here's the truth. Here's the evidence. Look for yourself. The public, already wary after seeing the original footage and the overwhelming misconduct uncovered in the investigations, was not so easily swayed. In fact, the more Reynolds and his allies pushed their narrative, the more desperate and petty they appeared. Mainstream media outlets, armed with clear evidence, refused to amplify the misinformation. Legal analysts dissected the tactics, exposing them as textbook smear campaigns. Civil rights groups rallied around Danielle even harder, organizing support rallies, publishing op-eds, and making sure the real story stayed front and center. Inside the precinct, Reynolds' remaining allies grew quieter. The officers who once nodded along with him in the hallways now avoided eye contact. His phone calls went unanswered. His attempts to organize internal support fizzled as colleagues realized that standing by him meant standing against the truth. Even former mentors, people who had once shielded him, publicly distanced themselves. Meanwhile, the legal case against Reynolds moved forward with crushing momentum. Internal Affairs compiled a damning report not only detailing the arrest but painting a full picture of his career, the ignored complaints, the patterns of behavior, the moments where the system had looked away. Prosecutors wasted no time building a strong case, stacking evidence piece by piece until it was undeniable. The day Reynolds was officially charged with aggravated assault, abuse of authority, and civil rights violations, there was no dramatic standoff. No last-minute rally of supporters. He stood quietly in a crowded courtroom, head bowed, a shell of the man who had once barked orders with impunity. As the charges were read aloud, there were no gasps, no surprises. Everyone already knew. The system that had once protected him was now holding him accountable, just as it should have from the beginning. Danielle Carter stayed true to the same principles that had guided her since the moment this fight began. She didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She simply continued her work, understanding that Reynolds' downfall wasn't the end goal. It was just one necessary step on a much longer journey toward real justice. And as the world moved on from Reynolds' desperate, failed counterattack, it was clear that no amount of noise could ever drown out the power of the truth. Change didn't come overnight. Danielle Carter knew that real transformation would be slow, sometimes frustrating, and often invisible to those looking for instant results. But as the weeks turned into months, the small signs began to show. Inside the precinct where it had all started, the old way of doing things started to unravel, replaced little by little with something better, something more honest. Captain Monroe took the first hard steps, knowing she couldn't afford half measures. Every officer in the precinct now wore a body camera, and not just for show. Strict policies were enforced about their use, and any footage edits or unexplained gaps were automatic grounds for disciplinary review. Training sessions that once felt like dull, checkbox exercises were rebuilt from the ground up. Officers weren't just being taught the law anymore. They were learning about bias, empathy, and de-escalation from real community members, not just instructors in uniforms. At first, there was resistance. Some officers muttered under their breath about politics and outside pressure. Others quietly put in for transfers, unwilling to adapt to the new expectations. But the ones who stayed, the ones who leaned into the discomfort and chose to grow, became the heart of the new culture taking shape. Danielle visited often, sitting in on training sessions, meeting with officers not to scold but to listen. She heard their fears, their doubts, and slowly, she helped turn those conversations into understanding. Outside the precinct walls, the community felt the difference too. Complaints about officer behavior dropped steadily. Calls for service became less tense and more cooperative. Neighborhood associations invited officers to meetings again, not to air grievances but to work together on real solutions. Parents who once warned their teenagers to avoid police at all costs now encouraged them to meet the new faces behind the badges. Trust was still fragile, still healing, but it was no longer just a word tossed around in press releases. It was becoming something real. Other cities watched closely. Word of Danielle's pilot program spread, and soon departments across the country were reaching out, asking how they could implement similar reforms. Some places faced steeper hills to climb, battling entrenched cultures that resisted change. But having a working model, proof that it could be done without dismantling the heart of policing, gave them something they had lacked for too long: hope. Danielle made it clear that this wasn't about making officers afraid to do their jobs. It was about helping them do their jobs the right way, with pride, with honor, and with the full support of the people they served. Accountability wasn't a punishment. It was a safeguard for everyone, officers and civilians alike. When mistakes happened, they were addressed openly, not buried. When successes happened, they were celebrated in the same spirit of transparency. New leadership programs sprouted within the department, focused on mentorship and community service. Young officers were paired with seasoned mentors who had embraced the reform, learning early that strength wasn't measured by how loudly you commanded a situation, but by how well you understood the people you served. Officers were encouraged to spend time outside of their patrol duties, volunteering at schools, attending town hall meetings, participating in neighborhood projects. These weren't publicity stunts. They were genuine efforts to weave the department back into the fabric of the community. Danielle saw it every time she visited. The change wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was steady. A quiet, growing shift in how officers carried themselves, how they interacted with people on the street, how they thought about their role. It showed up in small moments. A patrol officer kneeling beside a scared child instead of barking orders, a sergeant taking extra time to explain someone's rights during a traffic stop, a lieutenant inviting public feedback on new department policies before they were finalized. It would never be perfect. Danielle never expected it to be. But perfection wasn't the goal. The goal was a culture that self-corrected, that welcomed accountability instead of fearing it, that remembered its purpose was to serve, not to control. For the first time in a long time, Danielle believed that they were getting closer to that vision. Every changed mind, every small act of kindness, every officer who chose to lead differently became part of a bigger story. A story about what policing could be when courage meant more than authority, and service meant more than power. Danielle Carter had sparked a movement, but it was the officers and the communities together who were carrying it forward, step by step, toward something better. Danielle Carter never set out to leave a legacy. In the beginning, all she wanted was accountability for a wrong that had been done, not just to her but to countless others who would never get their moment of justice. But as the months turned into years and the reforms she championed took root, it became clear that what she had built was something much larger than she had ever imagined. It wasn't about one precinct or one city anymore. It was about a new way of thinking about law enforcement across the entire country. The precinct where her story had begun was now a symbol of change. Not perfect, not without challenges, but undeniably different. The walls once lined with generic slogans now carried real messages about transparency, service, and community trust. New officers walked the halls, many of them inspired to join because they had seen firsthand what true accountability looked like. Old systems that once hid misconduct had been dismantled. New oversight programs made sure that no complaint, no concern, no small warning sign would ever again be brushed aside. Danielle continued her work quietly, far from the cameras and headlines that had once swirled around her. She met with community leaders, mentored young officers, and advised lawmakers crafting new national policies on law enforcement standards. She traveled to academies, standing in front of fresh-faced recruits and telling them the truth, that the badge they would wear was not just a symbol of authority but a promise. A promise to serve with integrity, to protect without prejudice, and to be held to the highest standard not just by others but by themselves. In Washington, Danielle pushed for lasting federal reforms. She championed the creation of a national misconduct database, making it harder for bad actors to move quietly from department to department. She worked to establish stronger protections for whistleblowers, ensuring that officers who spoke out about wrongdoing wouldn't have to choose between their careers and their conscience. Her voice became one of the most respected in the conversation about modern policing, not because she spoke the loudest, but because she spoke with the kind of quiet authority that came from living the change she demanded. Communities responded too. Trust, once broken so deeply, began to rebuild one relationship at a time. Parents who had once feared calling the police started teaching their children that respect could be mutual. Neighborhood groups partnered with precincts to design better engagement programs. Town halls that used to end in shouting matches now ended with real plans and shared commitments. Even officers who had been skeptical at first found pride in the new culture. They stood a little taller when they walked their beats, knowing that their work meant something more than just enforcing laws. It meant building bridges, repairing damage, and showing up for their communities in ways that mattered. They knew they were being held accountable, but instead of resenting it, many embraced it, seeing it as a badge of honor in itself. Danielle often thought back to that quiet morning walk, the moment everything changed. She remembered the sound of the engine rolling behind her, the heavy air thick with judgment, the sharp sting of the cuffs around her wrists. She could still feel it sometimes, not as anger but as fuel. A reminder of why the fight had been worth every long night, every setback, every difficult conversation. She didn't need awards or ceremonies. Her reward was seeing the impact living and breathing around her. It was in the young officer who paused to listen instead of reaching for his handcuffs. It was in the grandmother who no longer hesitated to call the police when she needed help. It was in the communities that felt seen and heard in ways they never had before. Danielle Carter's story wasn't just about surviving an injustice. It was about transforming it into a movement that redefined what justice could look like when courage, accountability, and empathy led the way. And while she knew the work would never truly be finished, she also knew that the foundation had been laid strong enough to carry forward, long after she stepped back from the front lines. Change, real change, didn't come with noise or grand gestures. It came quietly, steadily, through 1,000 small moments where people chose integrity over comfort, service over pride. Danielle had lit the path. Now it was up to everyone else to keep walking it. Life teaches us that real strength is not measured by the power we hold over others, but by the integrity with which we use whatever power we are given. Danielle Carter's story reminds us that silence in the face of injustice allows broken systems to thrive, and that true change begins when someone chooses to stand up calmly, persistently, and bravely, even when it would be easier to walk away. It also shows that rebuilding trust takes time, patience, and consistent action, not grand speeches, but small daily choices made with honesty and compassion. For many of us who have lived through seasons of hardship and change, it's a powerful reminder that the fight for fairness and respect never really ends, and that every generation has a responsibility to leave the world a little better than they found it. No matter your age or background, the most meaningful impact often comes not from loud demands, but from quiet, determined action that refuses to give up, even when the odds seem overwhelming. It's never too late to stand for what's right, to demand better, or to set an example for the generations that follow. If this story touched you, please share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what kind of inspiring or meaningful stories you would like to see next. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, so you never miss out on the powerful, real-life lessons we bring to you. Your voice matters here, and together, we're building a community that believes in truth, fairness, and lasting change. Imagine being arrested at gunpoint just for walking in your own neighborhood, and the officer has no idea you're the director of the FBI. What happened next changed an entire nation forever. This is not just a story about injustice, it's a wake-up call for every one of us. Stay with us until the end, because what you learn today could change how you see power, trust, and justice. Smash that like button, subscribe now, and make sure you never miss another story that truly matters. Danielle Carter loved her morning walks. They were a rare slice of peace in a life otherwise packed with decisions, meetings, and responsibilities. That morning, the streets were still half asleep, with only a few joggers and early risers sipping coffee on their porches. The sun was just starting to spill its soft light over the neighborhood, casting long shadows and giving everything a golden hue. Danielle moved at a relaxed pace, taking in the stillness, letting herself breathe without the weight of her title pressing down. To everyone else, she was just another woman enjoying a quiet morning. But not to Officer Reynolds. He sat alone in his patrol car, parked awkwardly by the curb, engine idling low. From the moment Danielle crossed his line of sight, he watched her differently, not with casual observation but with suspicion. Danielle noticed it right away. It wasn't just a glance. It was the kind of look that measured her existence against some invisible checklist she would never be able to satisfy. Still, she kept walking, not speeding up, not slowing down. Her expression was calm, neutral, giving no sign she had noticed the scrutiny. But inside, a familiar knot formed in her stomach, the same one she had felt too many times before. As she continued, the patrol car moved slowly behind her, matching her pace just enough to be unsettling. She could hear the low hum of the engine growing louder and softer with each of her steps. When she reached the next block, the car finally pulled up beside her. The door creaked open, and Officer Reynolds stepped onto the sidewalk, his presence heavy and purposeful. His uniform was crisp, his movements sharp, each action calculated to remind anyone watching who was in charge. He approached with a mask of politeness stretched thin over a harder edge. Danielle stopped, keeping her hands visible and her posture open. She answered his questions with steady calmness, offering simple, honest replies. Yes, she lived nearby. No, she hadn't seen anything suspicious. She was just out for a walk. But it didn't matter. Reynolds wasn't looking for answers. He was looking for a reason. And when she didn't give him the fear or deference he seemed to expect, his tone shifted. What started as questions about her presence in the neighborhood quickly turned into demands. Where exactly did she live? Why was she walking alone? Could she prove she belonged here? Danielle knew the drill. It was never about her actions. It was about her existence. She maintained her calm, asking if there had been a report matching her description. He didn't have one. She asked if she had done anything wrong. He couldn't name a crime. But the more composed she remained, the more frustrated he became. The air thickened between them as Reynolds stepped closer, his hand hovering dangerously near his belt. Danielle's heartbeat quickened, but she refused to show it. She knew better than to escalate, better than to give him an excuse. She kept her voice even, her body language non-threatening, but it didn't matter. Officer Reynolds had already decided she was a problem simply for standing her ground. His questions grew sharper, his stance more aggressive. Each refusal to immediately obey made him bristle more, until the interaction was no longer about neighborhood safety, but about control. Danielle understood in that moment that this wasn't going to end fairly. She could comply fully, explain herself calmly, and it still wouldn't change the narrative he was determined to write. In Officer Reynolds' eyes, her very existence here was an act of defiance. That realization settled heavy in her chest as the situation continued to spiral. She wasn't just a woman out for a walk anymore. She had become a target, and no amount of reason or calm would undo the judgment. Officer Reynolds had already passed the moment he first laid eyes on her. Officer Reynolds' patience snapped all at once. Without warning, He reached for Danielle's arm, his grip firm, his body tense with a kind of aggression that needed no explanation. She stayed calm, trying to reason, but it was too late. The moment had passed. He pulled out his gun, shouting commands louder than necessary, as if to draw attention or create a scene where none had existed. Danielle complied, lifting her hands carefully, doing everything right, but Reynolds had already decided she was a threat. Within moments, he shoved her toward his patrol car, the cuffs snapping harshly around her wrists. The metal bit into her skin as she tried to steady her breathing, not because she feared for herself, but because she understood exactly what was happening. She knew that in his mind, this arrest wasn't about law or safety. It was about dominance. And he had no idea who he had just handcuffed. The ride to the precinct was a heavy silence broken only by the rumble of the car and the low muttering of Officer Reynolds, still trying to justify to himself what had just happened. Danielle sat quietly in the back seat, her cuffed hands resting in her lap, her mind already a few steps ahead. She wasn't angry, not yet. She wasn't scared either. She was simply waiting. She knew there would be a moment when all of this would turn, when the weight of what Reynolds had done would come crashing down around him, and she would be ready. When they pulled into the station lot, Reynolds parked with a hard jerk and came around to yank the door open. His hand gripped her arm tightly as he led her inside, forcing her to move faster than necessary, trying to show the other officers that he had things under control. But the moment they crossed the threshold into the precinct, the atmosphere shifted. The low buzz of morning activity paused. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. The sight of Reynolds dragging in a woman who looked nothing like the usual suspects they processed daily was enough to catch everyone's attention. Captain Monroe spotted them immediately. She was a no-nonsense leader who had seen her fair share of reckless arrests, but something about this one made her pause. Danielle caught the subtle narrowing of Monroe's eyes, the way her body shifted slightly forward as if already preparing to intervene. Reynolds marched toward the processing desk, spitting out words about resisting arrest and suspicious behavior, rattling off half-formed accusations as if saying them fast enough would make them true. Monroe stepped in, her voice calm but firm, cutting through Reynolds' explanation like a blade. She asked for ID. Reynolds hesitated, his mouth twisting into a grimace. He muttered that he hadn't gotten her ID yet. Monroe's eyebrow lifted just slightly, a silent question that hung heavy in the air. She signaled to the officer behind the desk to run the name Danielle Carter. The officer, a young man named Harris, began typing, his face lit only by the glow of the computer screen. The silence stretched long enough for a few uncomfortable glances to pass between the watching officers. Then Harris froze. His fingers hovered above the keyboard as he stared at the screen, his eyes widening. He looked up, then back at Monroe, his voice tight and almost disbelieving as he spoke. Danielle Carter was not just any civilian. She was the director of the FBI. For a moment, the room seemed to stop breathing. Monroe's head snapped toward Reynolds, her expression shifting from confusion to something far more serious. Reynolds stood stiffly, his face pale, his bravado draining with each second of silence that followed. Monroe demanded to know what had happened out there. Reynolds stumbled over his words, insisting he didn't know who she was, that she had been acting suspicious, that he was just doing his job. Monroe didn't buy it. Danielle could see it in the captain's eyes, the slow boiling anger that came from realizing the gravity of the mistake that had just been made under her watch. Danielle stayed quiet, her presence alone enough to speak volumes. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to demand respect. The truth of who she was, and how wrongly she had been treated, was plain for everyone to see. Monroe moved quickly, ordering Reynolds to step aside, calling for a medic to tend to Danielle's arm, and demanding an immediate review of the incident. The cuffs came off without ceremony, but the damage had already been done. As Danielle flexed her wrists and quietly accepted the apology Monroe offered with her eyes if not her words, she knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something bigger. Officer Reynolds had miscalculated badly, and now, his actions were about to set off a chain of consequences that would reach far beyond the walls of that precinct. Danielle Carter was not just going to walk away. She was going to make sure this moment led to real change. Word of what happened to Danielle Carter spread faster than anyone at the precinct could have imagined. At first, it was just whispers among the officers, quiet exchanges behind desks and in hallways as people tried to make sense of the disaster unfolding right inside their walls. But by the time the day ended, it was far bigger than internal gossip. It had spilled onto social media, sparked local news coverage, and ignited the kind of outrage that could not be contained. The words FBI director wrongfully arrested were enough to catch the attention of anyone scrolling past a headline. Add in the layer of racial profiling, and it became a firestorm. By the next morning, national outlets had picked up the story. Video clips of Danielle's calm demeanor compared to Officer Reynolds' aggressive behavior were already circulating online. Commentators, civil rights leaders, and legal experts weighed in with growing anger. The footage showed clearly that Danielle had never once posed a threat. She had not resisted. She had simply existed in a space Reynolds decided she didn't belong, and for that, she had been arrested at gunpoint. People saw it. They recognized it. And they were furious. Inside the precinct, the mood shifted dramatically. Officers who once brushed off complaints about profiling and misconduct were now walking on eggshells. The scrutiny was suffocating. Reporters camped outside the building. Protesters gathered across the street holding signs demanding justice and accountability. The city's mayor issued a public statement within 48 hours, calling the arrest disturbing and promising a full investigation. No one could pretend this was going away. Internal affairs moved quickly. They didn't have the luxury of slow, careful steps anymore. Federal authorities were now watching every move. Danielle's status as the director of the FBI meant that any attempt to sweep the incident under the rug would only make things worse. Captain Monroe understood this better than anyone. She knew her leadership, her integrity, and her department's future were all on the line. She ordered a complete review of the arrest, starting with every second of body camera footage, every radio call, every report Reynolds had ever filed. The footage was worse than anyone had hoped. It showed not just the escalation during the stop, but the dismissive attitude Reynolds carried from the moment he approached Danielle. It captured every refusal to answer her reasonable questions, every aggressive move, and the moment his gun discharged, grazing her arm. There was no spinning it. No editing could make it look like anything other than what it was, an abuse of power. At the same time, more troubling information began to surface about Officer Reynolds' record. Past complaints, long ignored or quietly closed, were pulled back into the light. Stories of similar stops, similar escalations, and a troubling pattern of targeting minority citizens came pouring in. Some officers whispered about it in private, admitting they had seen Reynolds cross lines before but never thought it would catch up with him. Others stayed silent, knowing that silence might now cost them too. As pressure mounted, Captain Monroe knew she had to do more than just suspend Reynolds. She needed to prove to the public, to the city, and to the country that they were serious about change. She brought in outside investigators to oversee the review. She welcomed federal oversight into the precinct's policies and practices. It was not a matter of pride anymore. It was a matter of survival. Meanwhile, Danielle remained measured in her public statements. She didn't lash out. She didn't allow herself to become the face of anger, though she had every right. Instead, she spoke about accountability, transparency, and the urgent need for reform. Her calm, composed presence only fueled the public's respect for her and deepened the embarrassment for the precinct.